Okay, why don't we get started? Again, my name is Paul Dorsett with Solvon, and for today's Insight session, the topic is parameter prompting, a feature that's been in Viewer since, version 5, actually. So we're going to talk about that, what it is, why you might consider using it. We'll go through kind of the definition, kind of the components or the pieces that make up setting up a parameter.
Muted.
And then we'll also look at creating one. You know, what are the steps to actually creating it? And then just some other information about the use of parameters in views. So the what and the why. Well, it's actually an even easier way for a user to specify filters for a dimension when they go to run a view. You know, one of the things that we try to do on each version or point version of Viewer is to make steps easier to do for filtering. When we talk about specifying members for dimensions. Again, in 6.5, we added a new filter icon up at the top of the screen that makes it just an easier step, easier way to provide filters as well. But parameter prompting is another approach to that. And it's very handy when you want to go into a view. Maybe you run a view every day and you want to look at, you know, specific values for a dimension, maybe a product family or a product group, things like that, and be able to look at those very, very quickly. Same view, just run it different for different values. It's also a very easy way to provide the filtering for casual or what I would call infrequent users of Viewer. So maybe they're folks that, yeah, they use Viewer every once in a while, get their numbers, but they're not really sitting there at their desk analyzing the data. You know, they want to get, you know, latest sales figures, what my open order looks like, the inventory looks like. So, as with everything, the more you use a product, the more fluent you get with the product, if you will, comfortable with the product. But there's still a segment of our user population that, you know, they don't use Viewer day in and day out and know all the different ways that you can, in this example, filter. So it's a nice way to provide that functionality in a very easy way for them to use. Another area for parameter prompting is it also makes it very convenient to select filters from when you're using Viewer on a mobile device, so it's an iPad, for example. It's just a very easy way to select members for a dimension when you're filtering. Now, parameter prompting is what we're going to look at today. Parameters in and of themselves are used in other ways in addition to as a user interface, if you will. And it provides really the means by which you can pass values into a view when you're running that view via a URL. So for example, you might be running a Viewer view from another application, whether it's Viewer, but it could be, for example, a SharePoint dashboard environment or a portal. You might want to run a Viewer view and want to run it for a particular customer, for example. Well, you can use parameters to pass that customer number over to the view. Same thing with Salesforce as an example. We're not going to talk today about parameter passing in the URL. We're going to set up a session in the next group of Insight classes specifically for that. Okay, so how do we define parameters within a Viewer view? There's really two steps. Well, there are two steps. One is what is called a parameter group, and you associate a parameter group with each dimension that you want to prompt the user for. You can have multiple parameter groups. If you want to prompt the user for, let's say, a customer number and maybe a product family. So again, your view prompt can have multiple parameter groups. You can also indicate within that parameter group whether the parameter is required or not. This really helps if the parameter or if the dimension that you want to filter on happens to be item number, for example, or a ship to number, where if it's not required, there obviously won't be any filtering on that dimension, and the view could be fairly long or large number of records returned for that. So for things like items, ship to numbers, anything that's got a large number of members in that dimension, this is a great way to, in essence, force the user to provide a value before running the view. And again, you can have multiple parameter groups per view. Now, for each parameter group that you define, then you define what I call a parameter type. How do you want the user to be able to select the values for that particular parameter? And there are 4 types. One is select members, very similar to what you do today in filtering. And not similar, it's exactly the same way. So for example, if in a view, if you said, I want to filter and I want to select members, then you're presented with a window that says either pick out of a list of these members, or if it's an advanced search, do a search, find the members or the values that you want, select those. Okay? So exactly the same approach that you would use for filtering. The same thing with user lists. I can say, or the parameter type for a dimension could be set to user list. And in that mode, then what's presented when the user is prompted for a value is a set of user lists that are defined for that particular dimension that they have access to, so either personal or global user lists. So those first two, select members and user lists, same exact way that you would use those in a filter today. Now the drop-down is a little bit different. The drop-down is what will happen there, and we'll go through each one of these. All the values are displayed for a particular dimension, and the user can then select one member out of that list. So it's very convenient to be able to see these, click on one, and then you can run your view. Obviously, it's not practical or not a good practice to set up a drop-down type parameter for dimensions that have large number of members. So again, things like items, ship tos, fill tos, those kinds of things, because the whole list viewer will attempt to show you the entire list, and then the user can select one of those. So they're very good, though, for things like product families, for example, or regions, divisions, things like that that have a small number of members in that particular dimension. The last one listed there is expression, and it's really from a parameter prompting standpoint isn't real practical, especially if you're gearing these prompts to more of the casual users. An expression, similar to what you could do in filtering, allows you to define an MDX expression that would be used to filter the members in that particular dimension. Again, it's not realistic to expect a casual user or even an everyday kind of user to enter that kind of expression value. So really, you're looking at the first three: the select members, the user list, and the drop-down are the most common that are used in parameter prompting. The other important thing to point out is that you can have multiple types per parameter group. So for example, I may have a parameter group set up for customer. I could provide one or more of the different parameter types to allow the user to select the values that they want to filter on. And again, we'll see that. In fact, we'll see that right now. So here's an example. The top portion is the actual view prompt that would appear when the user runs this particular view. As you can see, that the highlighted, or the bold rather, text shows the different parameter groups. And just as an aside, I'm a bit verbose in how I've labeled these, simply to point out the different pieces of the parameters themselves. So the stuff in bold, that's my parameter group. I've got two. One for a dimension called customer parent, and then one for a dimension called product family. Now within each of those, that's where I have the parameter types. For the customer parent, I've got the three, where I can do a select number, or I can do a select customer parent user list, or UL, or select from a drop-down. On the product family parameter group, I've just got the one, where I'm going to prompt them for selecting a member. Now the user, from a user perspective, they use the radio buttons on the side to select which method they want to use to select the values. So right now, and you can order these as to first, second, third in this particular case. So right now, the radio buttons are the select customer parents, so by member, and the select product families. If I were to click on the second one, the customer parent UL, that would make that one active, if you will. And then as I go over, excuse me, and click on the filter icon on the right-hand side, it would show me user lists. If I selected the drop-down, and then I dropped down that particular prompt box, that would show me all the numbers, and I could select one from there. Okay. The other thing to point out here, and we'll look at this in a minute, is you can specify whether or not a parameter is required or not. Now, if there isn't anything automatically that shows you what I've got here in parentheses, required or optional. Whoops, sorry about that. The wrong button. I put that in when I created the title for those product or parameter groups. Okay. If they weren't there and it was a required field and the user didn't specify a value, viewer would come back and say, oh, wait a minute, I need a value for that. I just find it convenient to inform the user that, hey, this parameter happens to be required. And you can do something like that where you put the literal required. Sometimes people put like an asterisk or something as to denote whether a value is required or not. And so as you can see down at the bottom, the result of running this happens to be whatever customer I selected, and in this case, the two product groups as well. A couple other things that we'll see as we're working with parameters. If you run a view that has a parameter, that has parameters set up in it, you will also see another icon up at the top in between the View Explorer and Charts. And that one allows you to, if you click on that, that will redisplay the parameter prompt window. And the last thing that we'll look at in terms of prompting is you can also prompt down for the presentation type. I don't know if you're familiar or have seen that before. But within the View Explorer, one of the things that you can specify is the output, if you will, of running the view. The type can be Viewer or the type can be Excel. And what you can do then is also you can prompt the user. So when they run this view, it will prompt them to say, hey, do you want to produce just a viewer view, or do you want it automatically, when I run that view, to download into Excel? One of the things to keep in mind is when we're talking about view prompts or parameter prompting, it's just another mechanism to initially run a view or rerun a view, like we saw with the reprompting. It doesn't prevent the user from doing anything else that you would normally do with a view. So once I run a view, I enter my prompts, I run the view, I can go into that view just like I would without parameter prompting. I can go in and change the filters, for example. I can resort it, I can drill. Okay, it's just parameter prompting is just a way to start the initial running of the view. Okay. And again, with the version 6.5, we added this filter, the change filter icon, up at the top to make that filtering selection a little bit easier. Okay, let me flip over to our demo environment and show you some examples. So obviously this is Viewer. It's version 6.7. So we've got the home page that's been around for a while. And also with 6.7, remember we added favorites and recent views, a nice convenient way to find those views that you have identified as favorites. So since I was getting ready for this insight, this particular view happens to be my favorite this week. And over on the right-hand side, this also shows views that I've used in the recent past. And we being Viewer, keeps track of, I think, up to 25 of the views that you ran or have run. From this favorite and recently used windows, I can just simply click on that particular view that I want to run. So this view has been set up, obviously, for with parameters, and here's my my view prompt window that comes up based on that definition. So again, as you can see, I've got the two different parameter groups. Right now, my radio buttons are selected, and if I go over now and click on the filter, since it's a member filter search, I've got my select members window that pops up. And here's where I can now click multiple one or multiple whatever I want to do. In this case, customer parents that I want the view to run for. And I can say OK. If I go ahead and run this now, I can just say OK. And the view will come back with just those 3 customer parents that I selected. Now in this case, I didn't select, and it was optional, anything to do with the product family. So it's going to show all product families sold for those particular customer parents. As you can see, here's my prompt window icon. Again, this view has parameters, so that's going to appear. I can go ahead and click on that, and I got my view prompt window back. So now instead of leaving this optional or blank, let's go into that product family and select just particular product families that I want to display for. And I'll just do the veggies and the fruit fillings here and say OK. Now, when I go to run that, now I've automatically filtered. So again, just a really easy way to pick and choose what members you want on those particular dimensions for filtering. Let's go back and show, I'm going to display my prompt window. Let's switch things around a little bit. Instead of doing a select member, let's do the customer parent user list. So I'm going to click on that radio button. Now that activates, if you will, that particular filter. I'll go over to my filter icon. And now this is going to display all the user lists that have been defined and I have access to related to customer parent. In this case, I have two. One of the things just to make note of, because it's not real obvious here, is if I highlight one of these and I go down to the bottom right-hand side and click on the button, I can see the different members that make up that particular user list. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. This particular user list has these 5 customer parents selected. Okay. If I come over and look at my other user list, I've got 3. Okay. So down at the bottom, again, this allows you to expand or compress that list. I'm going to go ahead and select this customer parent 2. Did I do that? Oh, apparently I didn't do that. I'm going to say OK. There we go. And now go ahead and run it. And now it's been filtered with that particular user list. Now again, all the features and functionality of just running a regular old view is still in play, if you will. If I hover over the filter, it shows me that it's with that particular user list, filtered with that list. Same thing with product. I can go into my filter icon, and it'll show me the same thing. Okay. So didn't take any functionality away. We just made it a little bit easier to make that initial running of the view, if you will. Let's go back into the view prompt and look at the drop-down. So I'm going to go ahead and select that radio button. And now as I pull this down, this shows me all the members that we have in the customer parent dimension. And I, as a user, can then go in and select a value. And I find this really very convenient if I'm running Viewer on my iPad, for example. I can bring up the list. All I have to do is select the particular value that I want to look at. Okay. If we bring up the prompt window one more time, again, down at the bottom, that's our presentation. I can control whether or not I prompt the user for that. Again, right now there's 2 values, Viewer, which is what obviously we've been looking at, or Excel. If I click on Excel and I run the view, down at the bottom, it's going to ask me to open up Excel. So for some customers, or some users rather, they want to run the view. They know every time I'm going to run the view and export it out to Excel. We can prompt them for that when they go to run the view initially. Again, I can go ahead and click on this. I can always export, obviously, out to this as well using this icon, the export to Excel. We're going to cancel that. Prompt, and we're going to switch this back to Viewer, otherwise we're going to be looking at Excel all the time. Okay, so that's kind of the usage standpoint. Very flexible. It gives the user a lot of different options on how to select those members. So let's now look at the view definition. I'm going to go ahead and open up the View Explorer. And as you can see up at the top, here's my parameter groups. Okay, we're all familiar with, on the grid standpoint, the rows and the columns and measure items, things like that. But up at the top, we've got the parameter groups. I'm going to go ahead and expand that. As you can see from a parameter group standpoint, I've got the 2. I've got the one for the customer parent. I have the one for product family. If I expand each of those parameter groups, this is where I define the different types. So again, in our example that we're using here, I've got it by member, by user list, and by dropdown for my customer parent. For product family, I've just got the one. So let's look at the properties for each of those. If I double click or right click and say properties, up at the, let's move this over a little bit. At the product group level, I give it a name, and that name is what appears in the view prompt itself. So in this particular case, I list it out as a customer parent parameter group. Again, I'm a little more verbose than it needs to be. And because I've got multiple different ways of selecting the values, that I put required up at the top there. Okay. The other thing, then you list what dimension that you want to prompt for. So in this particular case, it's for customer parent. And if the dimension that you pick has multiple or different levels within it, which might occur if you have virtual dimensions as well, you're able to specify that. And then finally, whether it's required or not. So in this particular case, I'm requiring a value for this particular prompt. If we look at the product family parameter group, same kind of thing. I give it a name. Again, this is our demo environment, so the dimension hierarchy and levels are a little bit different than what you probably have. But I've selected the product family, and then in this case, it's not required. Okay. So that's the parameter group level. Now within the parameter group, you have the different parameter types. Now at this level, the name is something that's just internal. It's within the view definition itself. It's not something that the user sees. The caveat there is there can't be any spaces. So as you can see, I've labeled the name and taken out all the different spaces. Then you define what type it is, whether it's a member, select member, user list, dropdown, or expression. So in this case, this is going to be a member. And now the prompt. How are you going to prompt the user? What's going to show up on the prompt screen to tell the user this is what you need to do? Okay. So in this case, something simple, select the different customer parents. You can provide a default value. Maybe every single time the user comes in and he wants to see a particular value to start with at that particular dimension. I could put in a value for that if I wanted to. And then the display text. There's a number of different options that you can use here. And this works in conjunction with, from an administrative standpoint, how you set up the search features for a particular dimension. I'm going to flip over to this other session that I've got going. And what I'm referring to there is under admin. So from a global perspective, one of the things that you can do is the select member options screen. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here, but for every dimension that you have defined within your viewer environment, Stratum environment, you can specify how you want to search for particular dimensions. So let's go down to customer parent here. And these values over here allow you to specify what columns of data for that particular dimension are going to show up in a search screen and what the default search by value is. So in this particular case, when I search at the customer parent level, these three things are going to show up: the customer parent number and description 1 and description 2. And by default, when I do a search, it's going to look for parent description 1. Okay. So if we go back to our parameter definition, I can specify any value or attribute that I have selected for this particular dimension. So within this view, if I open up this guy, I have the values, the descriptions, and 2 other attributes about customer parent, city and Providence State. I can use any of those as kind of the defaults when that user is doing the filtering. What I typically see is having this remain as view. So as you change your view, the display text will change accordingly as well. So that's my select members. If I go down to the customer parent by user list parameter type, that's what that one is, and the drill down as well. Okay. On the product family parameter group, I've just got the one type, and that was by select members. Okay. So that's the definition, and again, I can control, if I've got multiple parameter types for a parameter group, just like other things in a view, I can drag and drop them around to reorder them. So maybe I want to always have it so that the drop-down, is the first thing and the default that's been selected by the radio button, for example. Maybe that's the one I want to start with because I'm always using it on my iPad, for example. Now, as you can see, as I move that around, that's up at the top of my list. So when I come right into this view and I run it, all you got to do is select here, and I'm good to go. I'm off to running the view. Okay, I don't have to worry about changing that radio button. Not that it's a major deal, but that's the one that's going to be the default. So you're able to rearrange that as well. For a required, for a required parameter, let me switch that, and I'm not going to fill one in, even though it's required. What does viewer do? It'll come back with a message. I got to enter one. So I'll go ahead and key that in, or select one rather. Now I'm good to go. So that's parameter prompting. Again, a nice way to provide just yet another way to allow the user to enter values or filter values for different dimensions. I show 2 here. Obviously, you can have more. You can have 1. You can do whatever you want in terms of how you want to filter the data.
Unmuted.
I'm going to go ahead and open up the phone lines, if you will. If there's any questions, anything you'd like for me to go back over, anything specific that you want to discuss. Any questions?
I have a quick question about the radio buttons. Is that a standard, like as soon as you have multiple, the radio buttons automatically show up on that prompt window?
Interestingly enough, let me go back to that view. Even with a single product type defined, there's a radio button. Can't turn it on or off, but it's going to show up.
Okay.
Yeah. So it only really becomes functional if you have more than one.
Multiple.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
along for the ride. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if anything comes up while you're thinking about it, again, a couple ways to contact us. Feel free. We're more than happy to answer any other questions. The next session that we'll be doing in a couple weeks, so Friday, June the 30th, it's going to be all about working with Viewer or Stratum and Excel, where they're sending information out to Excel, maybe using Stratum as a data source for Excel, that kind of stuff. So certainly encourage you to attend if you're available. Otherwise, if there are any other questions, I appreciate everybody's time, and have a great weekend.